I never thought a simple favor would turn into the biggest regret of my life. I never thought a moment of kindness would make me question everything about myself. But that's exactly what happened. And now, every time I close my eyes, I see it. I feel it. I relive it over and over, like a nightmare I can't escape. It started as something small, innocent, a conversation, a little advice, a harmless request. But the thing about crossing lines is, you don't always see them until you're already on the other side. By the time I realized what I had done, what I had allowed to happen, it was too late. I wish I could say I never saw it coming, that it caught me off guard. But the truth? Some part of me knew. Some part of me felt it before it happened. And instead of stopping it, instead of walking away, I let it happen. And now I live with the consequences. This isn't an easy story to tell. It's raw, messy, the kind of thing that makes you question who you really are. But I have to share it. Because if I don't, it'll eat me alive. And maybe someone out there understands. If you've ever been tempted by something you knew was wrong, if you've ever felt seen by someone you weren't supposed to feel seen by, if you've ever done something you swore you'd never do, then stay with me. Because by the time we reach the end, you'll understand why I can never take it back. Make sure you're subscribed to Shocking Infidelity Saga. Because trust me, this is just one of many stories that will leave you questioning everything. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. I was never the type to feel lonely in a crowded room. I had spent years perfecting the art of being unnoticed. It's what happens when you're married to a man who stopped seeing you a long time ago. I don't even remember when it started. The slow fading, the silence that crept into our marriage like a shadow, stretching longer and darker with each passing year. Conversations turned into nods. Affection turned into obligation. Love into routine. He worked late. Always. When he came home, he barely looked at me. When he spoke, it was about work, bills, or things that needed fixing around the house. The man I once knew was still there, physically, but emotionally, he had disappeared. And somewhere along the way, I disappeared too. I told myself it was normal. That all marriages settle. That passion fades. That maybe this was just the price of stability. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had become invisible. Then came him. My husband's son from his first marriage. In his early 20s. Confident, but not in an arrogant way. Observant, in a way that made you feel like he actually listened. When he spoke, there was warmth in his voice. When he looked at you, there was intent. And then there was her. His girlfriend. Young, nervous, sweet. The kind of girl who still believed in fairy tales. She was shy, eager to please, always looking to him for reassurance. The way she adored him reminded me of who I used to be years ago, before life had worn me down. That night, they had come over for dinner. Nothing unusual. A warm summer evening. The air thick and slow, the kind of night where even time feels heavy. The three of us sat around the table while my husband was, as always, absent, either in his office or buried in his phone. I had stopped keeping track. At first, the conversation was light. Small talk. They told me about their plans, their future, the little moments in their relationship that made them happy. But at some point, something shifted. The tone changed. The air grew thick with something unspoken. She was the one who brought it up first. She laughed nervously, pushing her food around on her plate. "Can I ask you something?" I nodded. "How do you know when it's the right time?" For a second, I didn't understand what she meant. But then I saw the way she glanced at him. The slight blush on her cheeks. The way he smirked, amused but not mocking. She was talking about that. I don't know why I suddenly felt breathless. Maybe it was the directness of it. Maybe it was the way he looked at me, waiting for my answer. Maybe it was something else entirely, something I wasn't ready to admit. I could have brushed it off. I could have laughed, changed the subject, told her that was something she should figure out on her own. But I didn't. Instead, I answered. And in that moment, everything started to change. I hesitated before answering. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because of the way he was looking at me. She was the one who had asked the question, but it was his gaze that unsettled me. Steady. Unblinking. a quiet curiosity behind it, as if he was searching for something beneath my words. I forced a smile, keeping my tone light. Well, it's different for everyone. She nodded, eager, leaning in. But how do you know when you're ready? When it's right? Her innocence was almost endearing. She reminded me of myself, back when love still felt new. When there was still excitement in the unknown. I had been that girl once, nervous, uncertain, wanting to do everything right. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I glanced at him. He was listening intently, his expression unreadable. His fingers tapped lazily against the side of his glass, his posture relaxed, but somehow aware. I turned my attention back to her. It's about trust. Feeling safe. Knowing the person you're with understands you. She bit her lip. But what if you overthink it? What if you never feel ready? I let out a soft breath. Then maybe it's not about a perfect moment. Maybe it's about who makes you feel ready. Silence. A pause just long enough to be felt. And then he spoke. That's actually a good point. His voice was smooth, steady. The kind of voice that held weight even in casual conversation. He wasn't looking at her when he said it. He was looking at me. Something shifted. Subtle, but undeniable. She smiled, completely oblivious, turning to him. See? That's what I mean. You always make me overthink everything. He chuckled, but there was something in his expression that didn't quite match the sound. His eyes lingered on me for a second longer than they should have. And I felt it. I told myself I was imagining things. That I was overanalyzing a perfectly normal conversation. But deep down, I knew better. Because for the first time in a long time, someone was looking at me like I was interesting. Like I was worth listening to. And it felt good. I should have left it at that. But I didn't. I kept talking, kept leaning in, kept answering their questions, even as the conversation grew more personal. She asked about connection, about attraction, about how to tell the difference between love and desire. I gave answers that were careful, measured, but the weight of his stare made every word feel heavy. At some point, I realized I was no longer speaking just for her. I was speaking for him, and I hated how much I liked it. That night, long after they had left, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my husband beside me, fast asleep. I could hear his slow, even breathing, could feel the weight of him there, but he felt a million miles away. I tried to remember the last time he had touched me, the last time he had looked at me like I was someone worth wanting. But I couldn't. I knew we had once been close. Once had nights where we tangled in the sheets, where I felt his hands on my skin and believed, without question, that I was loved. But that was so long ago it felt like another life. Now, he barely noticed me. I turned onto my side, trying to push away the memory of the conversation at the dinner table. The way he had looked at me. The way his voice had deepened when he agreed with something I said. The way my heart had reacted. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. I was overthinking. I was being ridiculous. I was just helping them. That's all it was. I was an older woman, giving advice to a young couple who needed guidance. That was it. Nothing more. But then why did my stomach tighten every time I replayed the way he had watched me? Why did my skin feel warm, my chest tight with something I didn't want to name? I pressed my palms against my face, willing myself to let it go. It wasn't real. It was just attention. I was starved for it, and I mistook it for something more. That was all. I shifted under the covers, but the sheets felt cold. My husband's back was turned to me, as always. If I reached for him now, he'd either pull away or sigh in exhaustion, half asleep and disinterested. I didn't reach for him. I had given up trying a long time ago. And that's when I realized why it had felt so good to be looked at like that. Because it had been so long since I had. For years, I had convinced myself that I didn't need affection anymore. That marriage was about more than passion, that love was deeper than physical desire. That the fire we once had wasn't necessary to keep our life together standing. But the truth was, I did need it. I missed it. And for one brief moment, I had felt it again. Not from my husband, but from him. I should have stopped there. But I didn't. The next time they came over, I told myself it was just another visit. Nothing more. I had replayed that conversation in my mind so many times, convincing myself it was nothing. That I had imagined the tension. That I had mistaken his looks, his tone, his presence, for something it wasn't. But when they arrived, when I saw him step through the door, I felt it again. That invisible pull. That awareness. I had dressed without thinking about it, or at least that's what I told myself. A simple sundress, light, effortless. But when his eyes flickered over me, just for a second too long, I knew. I had wanted to be seen. The evening started off normally. Small talk, laughter, his girlfriend as sweet and naive as ever. My husband, as usual, had buried himself in work, locked away in his office. At some point, she brought it up again. Relationships. Love. Intimacy. She sighed, frustrated, resting her chin in her hands. I just want to do it right. I don't want it to feel awkward. She laughed as she said it, but there was something earnest in her words. I smiled, keeping my voice soft, reassuring. It's always awkward at first. The important thing is feeling comfortable. She nodded. But how do you get comfortable? I hesitated. I should have given a vague answer. Something simple. But I felt his eyes on me again. Waiting. I shifted in my seat. It's all about trust. Body language. Knowing how to read each other. She perked up. Body language? I nodded. A lot of connection is nonverbal. She leaned in, intrigued. Like what? I glanced at him. He hadn't moved, but I could feel the way his attention was locked on me. I lifted my arm slightly and ran a slow hand down my forearm. Touch, for example. Soft at first. Light. Not too much pressure. She mimicked the motion on her own arm, giggling at the sensation. That actually feels nice. I smiled. Because it's intentional. He didn't mimic the motion. He just watched. I should have stopped there. But I didn't. She was eager, oblivious. She wanted to learn. I showed her how a small, casual touch could feel intimate if done with purpose. How holding eye contact for just a beat longer could shift the meaning of a glance. How slowing down the space between two people could turn anticipation into something electric. She practiced on him, resting her fingers on his wrist, giggling as he smirked at her. But his smile was different now. His body was relaxed, but there was something beneath it. A tension neither of us acknowledged. She was having fun. But he and I, we were playing with something else entirely. A touch that lasted a second too long. A glance that should have broken away but didn't. A silence that stretched, heavy with something unspoken. I told myself it was just an innocent moment. Just advice. Just conversation. But the way my skin tingled where his gaze lingered told me otherwise. I felt it. And I knew he did too. The air in the room had changed. She didn't notice. But we did. And my husband? He was still in his office. Still unaware of what was happening under his own roof. I could feel the shift between us. Palpable. Dangerous. I should have ended it. But I didn't. The moment it happened, I knew there was no going back. It was late. The night had stretched longer than expected. My husband still locked away in his office, the distant hum of his keyboard the only proof of his existence. The three of us remained in the living room, bathed in the dim glow of the lamp, shadows stretching long across the floor. She had been yawning, rubbing her eyes, her exhaustion starting to weigh her down. But he was still there. Still present. Still watching. And then he asked, "How do you know when someone really wants it?" His voice was smooth, careful, but there was something underneath it. A slow pulse thudded in my chest. His girlfriend, half asleep beside him, barely reacted. But I did. I shouldn't have. I should have shrugged it off, laughed, brushed it away like it meant nothing. But I felt the weight of his stare. The curiosity. The unspoken question beneath the words. I swallowed, my mouth suddenly dry. No, I said, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. His eyes didn't leave mine. The air between us thickened, that slow, dangerous pull tightening, wrapping itself around us, dragging us closer to something neither of us should have been near. She stretched, groaning as she rubbed her temples. Ugh, I need to use the bathroom. She pushed herself up from the couch, yawning again, and disappeared down the hall. I should have stood up. I should have put space between us. But I didn't. I stayed right where I was. And so did he. The silence swelled between us, stretching, tightening. His fingers drummed slowly against his knee. His jaw clenched, then released. And then, I think I know, he said. My breath caught. I wanted to pretend I didn't understand. That I hadn't felt this tension growing, twisting into something impossible to ignore. But I did. He knew. And I knew too. I should have looked away. But I didn't. My pulse pounded in my ears. My stomach tightened, heat crawling up my neck. His eyes flickered down, just for a second. A brief, nearly imperceptible glance. And that was it. That was all it took. Not a touch. Not a word. Just a glance. A glance that should have meant nothing. But it meant everything. A glance that crossed the line. A glance that sealed our fate. Footsteps echoed down the hall. His girlfriend was coming back. And in that split second before she reappeared, before reality could crash back down, before I could stop myself, I let it happen. I let that moment exist between us. I let him see it. I let myself feel it. And I could have walked away. I should have. But I didn't. The second she stepped back into the room, everything changed. The warmth, the tension, the quiet hum of something unspeakable hanging in the air, it all evaporated the moment she reappeared. She smiled, stretching her arms above her head, completely unaware of the invisible line that had just been crossed. But he knew. And so did I. He shifted, his posture suddenly different, more rigid, less at ease. His hands clenched into loose fists, then relaxed again. His eyes darted toward me once, so quick, so fleeting, but I caught it. And I felt it. I forced my body to move. I picked up a glass, pretending to take a sip of water even though my throat was too tight to swallow. I tucked my hair behind my ear, as if that small, meaningless motion could somehow reset the last few minutes. She plopped down beside him, nudging his shoulder playfully. Did I miss anything? I let out a small laugh, too forced, too unnatural. No, nothing at all. Nothing at all. Except for the fact that my heartbeat still hadn't slowed. Except for the fact that I could still feel the weight of his gaze, even though he was now avoiding looking at me. Except for the fact that I had let it happen. He stood up abruptly, stretching, running a hand through his hair. We should probably get going. It's getting late. Her face fell, confused. Already? But I thought he was already grabbing his keys. She hesitated, looking at me for some kind of answer, but I had none to give. Instead, I smiled, small, careful, fake. He's right. It is late. She sighed, disappointed, but didn't argue. I walked them to the door, my movement stiff, rehearsed. I didn't trust myself to look at him again. I didn't trust myself at all. He barely said goodbye. No lingering glances. No hesitation. Just a muttered, "Thanks for dinner," before stepping past me, leading her toward the car. She turned back as they reached the driveway. Did I say something wrong? The question cut through me. She was sweet. Kind. Oblivious. She didn't know. She had no idea what had just shifted beneath her feet. I shook my head, my voice steady even though my stomach was in knots. Of course not. You didn't do anything wrong. That was the truth. She hadn't. I had. I watched as they pulled away, the red glow of their taillights disappearing down the street. And then I stood there, staring at the empty road, my hands trembling at my sides. I had told myself it was harmless. That nothing had really happened. That it was just a glance, a moment, a fleeting second of something that would pass. But it didn't feel fleeting. It felt like a beginning. And that terrified me. I sat in the silence of my own home, staring at nothing, my thoughts running in circles I couldn't escape. I replayed it again. Every glance. Every unspoken word. The shift in the air that only he and I had felt. And I asked myself, did I just betray my husband? Or was I fooling myself into believing that it was nothing? That a glance, a moment, A single breath of something forbidden lingering between us wasn't real enough to call it a betrayal. Because if it wasn't real, why couldn't I shake it? Why was it still burning under my skin, making my hands tremble, my stomach twist, my pulse race even now, long after he was gone? I pressed my fingertips against my temple, squeezing my eyes shut. I shouldn't feel this way. I shouldn't feel anything at all. He was my husband's son. He was young. He had his own life, his own relationship, his own future laid out in front of him. And yet, in that moment before she had walked back into the room, he had looked at me in a way no one had in years. And I had let him. I let myself feel it. I let myself hold on to it longer than I should have. And now? Now, I was stuck in the aftermath of something that never should have begun. Did he feel the same? Or had I just imagined it all, warped something meaningless into something dangerous, because I was so desperate to feel seen again? Would he tell anyone? No, he wouldn't. I knew that much. He wasn't stupid. He understood the weight of what had passed between us, even if neither of us dared to name it. But the worst question, the one I could barely let myself think, was the one that gripped my chest the tightest. What if it had gone further? What if we hadn't been interrupted? What if I had looked at him a second longer? If he had stepped closer? If I had let him? Would I have stopped it? Or would I have let it happen? I swallowed hard, shaking my head, trying to push the thought away, trying to silence the part of me that already knew the answer. I couldn't let this happen again. I couldn't let another moment like this slip through, tightening the grip of something I would never be able to undo. Because if I let it happen once, it would happen again. And next time, I might not stop at just a glance. I don't know what happens next. I don't know if this feeling will fade, if the weight of my own guilt will be enough to smother it before it grows into something I can't control. Or if, deep down, I don't want it to fade at all. Maybe that's the worst part, knowing that I should regret it, but not fully wanting to. Knowing that if I could go back to that moment, if I could relive that charged, dangerous second before she came back into the room, I don't know if I'd change anything. And that terrifies me. Because I used to think I knew myself. I used to believe I was a good person. A faithful wife. Someone who would never even think about stepping outside the boundaries of my marriage. But now I don't know anymore. Because the truth is, it wasn't just the attention. It wasn't just the validation, the thrill, the excitement of being seen after years of feeling invisible. It was him. And the way he looked at me. And the way I let him. I wish I could tell you that I'll never let it happen again. That I'll stop it before it turns into something I can't take back. But if I'm being honest with myself, I don't know if I will. And that's what scares me the most. Tell me, have you ever been in a situation where you felt something you knew you shouldn't? Have you ever stood at the edge of a decision, heart pounding, knowing that one more step in the wrong direction could change everything? What did you do? How did you stop yourself? Or did you? I need to know I'm not alone in this. Leave a comment. Tell me your thoughts. Tell me your stories. Because right now, I feel like I'm standing at the edge of something dangerous, staring down at everything I could lose. And part of me is afraid I might jump. If you haven't already, subscribe to Shocking Infidelity Saga. Because this is just the beginning. And if you think you know how this ends, you don't.